Before the war, he was a chicken farmer in Spain. He had never served a single day in the military. He had never fired a weapon. He had no training, no rank, no government connections. Nothing but a typewriter and an almost supernatural gift for telling stories. And on June 6, 1944, the day 156,000 Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy, he was the single most important person on the Allied side. Not Eisenhower, not Patton, not Churchill, him, a chicken farmer, and he won the war with a lie. His name was Juan Pujol García, and this is his story. Most people think they know D-Day, the landing craft, the beaches, the courage of the men who crossed that water under fire. That story is real, and it deserves every word that has ever been written about it. But behind it, invisible, running like a hidden current beneath the entire battle, was something else. A deception so complete and so masterfully executed that the most powerful military machine in Europe was left standing on the wrong coast of France, waiting for an enemy that was never coming, while the real invasion was decided somewhere else entirely. By the time the Germans understood what had happened, the war was already over. To understand how a lie of this magnitude was possible, you have to understand one thing about the German High Command in the spring of 1944. These were not stupid men. They were not amateurs. The officers of the Wehrmacht General Staff were the finest military professionals in Europe. They had conquered Poland in 5 weeks. They had crushed France, the nation the whole world assumed was unconquerable, in 6. They had fought the Soviet Union across a front stretching from the Arctic Circle to the Black Sea. These were brilliant, experienced, ruthless soldiers at the absolute peak of their profession, and they had a blind spot so large you could drive an army through it. They were absolutely certain they knew where the Allies were going to attack. The Pas de Calais, a flat stretch of French coastline sitting directly across the English Channel from the white cliffs of Dover. 21 miles of gray water, the shortest crossing between England and France, with roads and railways running straight from the coast into the industrial heart of Germany. In the German military mind, this was not merely the probable invasion site. It was the only logical one. Any competent commander would choose the shortest route. Any rational strategist would aim for the fastest path to Germany's vital center. The Allies were competent. The Allies were rational. Therefore, the Allies would attack the Pas de Calais. This belief had stopped being an assessment. It had become a fact, a fixed star around which all other intelligence was organized. Anything that supported it was accepted. Anything that contradicted it was dismissed. They had built, without knowing it, a mental fortress around a single assumption, and the British had noticed. In a quiet building in London, a small group of intelligence officers looked at that German certainty and saw something extraordinary. They saw a door. If the Germans were already convinced the attack was coming at the Pas de Calais, you did not need to trick them into believing it. You simply needed to confirm what they already believed. Give them the evidence they were already primed to receive. Reinforce the assumption until it became so solid, so layered with apparent proof from every direction that nothing could shake it. Give a man the evidence that proves what he already believes, and you have not merely deceived him. You have made him your partner in his own destruction. They called the operation Fortitude, and at its center was a ghost. The ghost had a name. The 1st United States Army Group, FUSOG. On paper, it was the largest single concentration of Allied military power ever assembled on British soil. Dozens of divisions, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, trucks, and landing craft. It was positioned in southeastern England, directly across from the Pas de Calais, and according to every piece of intelligence the Germans received, it was preparing for the decisive blow of the war. German aircraft photographed its camps from high altitude. German signals intelligence intercepted its radio traffic, thousands of messages every week, the ordinary noise of a massive army going about its business, ordering boots and rations, requesting vehicle parts. Officers filing complaints about the weather. It was bureaucratic, mundane, and utterly convincing. There was only one problem. None of it existed. The camps were wood and canvas. The tanks were inflatable rubber, shaped to look like Shermans from 30,000 feet. The landing craft were plywood frames under tarpaulins, anchored where German aircraft would see them. The radio traffic was generated entirely by a British signals unit working around the clock from a script, mimicking a real army's pattern of communication. And the agents who confirmed everything, every single one of them, was either a British double agent or a fiction created by one man sitting alone at a typewriter in London. That man was the chicken farmer, Juan Pujol García. His story begins not in England but in pre-war Spain, where he had watched fascism rise and made a quiet, private decision that he would spend whatever was left of his life fighting it. He approached British intelligence and offered to spy for them. They turned him down. He was unknown, untrained, and they had no use for him, so he went to the Germans instead. He walked into a German consulate and told them he was a passionate supporter of the Reich who wanted to serve the Führer. They were cautious at first, but Pujol was patient, and eventually they recruited him. They believed they were sending him to England to build a spy network. He went to Lisbon. He had never been to England in his life. From a rented room in Portugal, using a tourist guidebook, an outdated railway timetable, and whatever British magazines he could find at newsstands, he began to invent. He created agents, fictional people with names, backgrounds, habits, and personalities. A Welsh nationalist who hated the English, a traveling salesman who moved around Britain for his work, a sympathetic contact in the War Office. He gave each one a distinct voice. And then he had them report to Berlin, through him, about British military movements and intentions. The reports mixed publicly available information with plausible invention and carefully measured fiction. Berlin received them, verified what they could, found them consistent, and concluded their new agent was exceptional. They paid him. They gave him resources. They asked for more agents, and he invented more, each one more elaborately realized than the last, until his network numbered 27 people spread across Britain, reporting on everything from troop movements to factory output. Not one of them was real. When British intelligence finally tracked him down, expecting to find a sophisticated German operation, they found a man in Lisbon with a typewriter and a travel guide. They were speechless. They brought him to London, gave him the codename Garbo, after Greta Garbo, because they believed he was the greatest actor alive, and put him at the center of the biggest deception in the history of warfare. Through his network of invented agents, Garbo fed Berlin a continuous stream of intelligence about Fusag. Its strength, its readiness, its command structure. His reports were vivid, detailed, and perfectly calibrated to confirm everything the Germans already believed. He was not merely telling them what they wanted to hear. He was constructing a reality for them, brick by fictional brick, one message at a time. But the Ghost Army still needed one more thing to make it completely believable. It needed a commanding general. And the British knew exactly who would make every German officer in France stop breathing for a moment when his name crossed their desks. George Patton. Patton was not a fictional creation. He was the most feared, most studied, most obsessively analyzed American general in Europe. The German High Command had examined him the way a chess grandmaster examines his most dangerous opponent. He was, in their professional judgment, the only American commander with the aggression, the brilliance, and the ruthless instinct to lead a major strategic offensive. He was the kind of general you assign to your most important mission. When German intelligence confirmed, through multiple independent sources, that Patton had been placed in command of Fusog, the question of whether the Pas de Calais invasion was real effectively closed. Of course they would give their best army to their best general. Of course Patton would lead the decisive blow. The logic was perfect, because the British had engineered it to be perfect. What the Germans did not know was that Patton had been assigned to Fusog specifically because his presence there would be so convincing. He was bait. The most elaborately costumed piece of bait in military history. He drove around southeastern England in his staff car, gave speeches at carefully chosen public events, appeared at locations where German agents would report him. He was furious about it. He wanted a real battle. Instead, he was fighting a performance. And he was magnificent. By the spring of 1944, German intelligence had assembled a picture of Allied intentions so coherent and so thoroughly reinforced from so many directions that it had become self-sustaining. The Pas de Calais belief no longer required maintenance. It simply was. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, commanding all German forces in the West, had positioned his best units accordingly. The 15th Army, nearly 250,000 men, well-equipped and well-supplied, sat on the cliffs of the Pas de Calais and waited for Patton. And in Normandy, defended by a patchwork of understrength and second-rate divisions, the real invasion was coming. Field Marshal Rommel saw this, and it frightened him in a way that very little had ever frightened him. He had spent months driving the length of the Atlantic Wall in a gray staff car, stopping at every position, walking every beach, examining every bunker. What he found was not a fortress, it was a facade, a propaganda creation. In some places, the concrete was barely dry. The minefields were sparse. The troops were a mixture of genuine veterans and men who were too old, too young, or too broken to serve anywhere else. Rommel had lost a campaign in North Africa. He knew exactly what Allied air power and logistics could do to German armored formations caught in the open. He knew with cold certainty that the Atlantic Wall could not stop a determined Allied assault. It could slow it. It could make it expensive. But if the Allies survived the first hours on the beach, they would pour in men and machines until the defenders were simply overwhelmed. His only chance, Germany's only chance, was to destroy the invasion at the waterline on day one. The panzer divisions had to be right behind the beaches, hidden in the orchards and villages of Normandy, ready to counterattack within hours of the first landing. Not days, hours. Because hours were all there would be. He told Hitler this, more than once, with the urgency of a man who had already watched one campaign collapse because the lesson came too late. Hitler heard him, and compromised. He gave Rommel 3 panzer divisions. He kept the rest, the SS Panzer Corps, the Panzerlehr, the absolute cutting edge of German armored power, under his own personal authority. No one could move them without the Führer's direct order. He was saving them for the real invasion, the one at the Pas de Calais. A.T. 12 minutes past midnight on June 16, 1944, British paratroopers descended from a dark sky over the fields of Normandy. Within the hour, frantic reports flooded into German headquarters from observation posts along the coast. Paratroopers landing everywhere. Gliders in the fields, explosions in the dark. The picture was chaotic and contradictory. Partly this was the nature of a night airborne operation. Partly it was deliberate. The Allies had scattered hundreds of dummy paratroopers across a dozen different locations. Small cloth figures packed with explosives, sent to send German garrison troops racing through the countryside after enemies made of rags. The real paratroopers moved largely undisturbed. General Erich Marx, commanding the 84th Corps, stared at the incoming reports and saw no coherent pattern. His training told him this was a feint, a diversion designed to pull his reserves away from the real landing zone. He was not wrong to think that. He was wrong about which coast was real. Paralyzed by the fear of committing to the wrong location, he placed his forces on alert and waited. The 21 St. Panzer Division, the one armored unit close enough to the beaches to make a difference, sat near Caen and waited for orders that took nearly 3 hours to arrive. 3 hours. In the mathematics of an amphibious assault against a defended coastline, 3 hours is a geological age. At 10 minutes to 6 in the morning, the sea opened up. 138 warships opened fire on 5 beaches simultaneously. The ground shook 20 miles inland. Concrete bunkers cracked under direct hits. Telephone lines connecting defensive positions to their headquarters snapped in the first minutes. Radios went dead. The Atlantic Wall, that carefully engineered system of overlapping strongpoints designed to support one another, was dismantled in 30 minutes into a series of isolated, terrified, half-deafened positions, each one completely alone. And then the ramps came down. The bow doors of hundreds of landing craft swung open, and the men inside ran forward into the water and the fire. At Omaha Beach, soldiers were cut down before they reached the sand, in water chest deep, by machine gun fire from positions the naval bombardment had not destroyed. Company after company took catastrophic losses in the first minutes, and still they came. They crawled. They clawed up the shingle. They died by the hundreds, and the ones still alive stood up and kept moving forward. In German headquarters across northern France, the scale of what was being reported triggered exactly the crisis Rommel had predicted. Von Rundstedt, looking at 5 simultaneous beach landings backed by the largest naval bombardment in history, concluded this was not a diversion, and formally requested the release of the reserve panzer divisions. His request reached Hitler's headquarters in Bavaria. Hitler was asleep. General Alfred Jodl, his operations chief, received the request and made the decision that would define military catastrophe for the next 80 years. He decided not to wake the Führer. The risk of interrupting Hitler's sleep with what might still prove to be a false alarm, for a man who had raged at subordinates for lesser interruptions, seemed in that moment worse than the risk of waiting. The panzers sat with cold engines. Their crews stood by their machines and listened to the distant sound of the guns. When Hitler finally woke, was briefed, and looked at the reports from Normandy, he was, by multiple accounts, almost calm. He had predicted this. The Normandy landings were exactly what he had expected, a diversion to draw his armor away from the Pas de Calais before the real blow fell. He would not take the bait. The reserve panzers were released at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 10 hours after the first Allied soldier touched French soil, 10 hours during which the beachhead had been consolidated, reinforced, and made survivable. And as the panzers finally moved toward the battle, the sky turned against them. The Allied fighter bombers, the P-47 Thunderbolts, the RAF Typhoons, the aircraft the Luftwaffe could no longer challenge because German air power over Western Europe had ceased to exist, fell on the German columns with a systematic ferocity that turned every road in Normandy into a killing ground. The Panzer-Lehr Division, one of the finest armored formations on Earth, lost dozens of vehicles before firing a single shot against Allied infantry. The moment was gone. The beach was held. But the lie still had one final act, and it was the most important act of all. In the days after D-Day, as the Allied beachhead grew stronger and German commanders pleaded desperately for permission to move the 15th Army from the Pas de Calais to Normandy, Garbo sent a message to Berlin. It arrived 3 days after the landings, at the exact moment of maximum German uncertainty, when the decision about the 15th Army was still unresolved. Garbo told Berlin that his most reliable sources inside the Allied command had confirmed the truth. The Normandy landings were exactly what Hitler believed them to be: a diversion. The real invasion, Fusog, Patton, the main blow, was still coming. Still aimed at the Pas de Calais. Moving the 15th Army now, he warned, would be the single greatest strategic blunder Germany could make. The message was authenticated and cross-referenced and delivered to Hitler within hours. An order went out from the Führer's headquarters. The 15th Army would remain in position, 250,000 men, waiting, watching the wrong coast. While in Normandy, the beachhead grew from a strip of sand into something that could no longer be taken back. They waited through June. They watched while the Americans and British and Canadians fought their way inland through the hedgerow country, through the rubble of Norman villages, through weeks of grinding, costly battle. They waited through July. They watched while American engineers and logisticians built the infrastructure of an occupation, roads and depots and fuel lines and field hospitals directly behind the beachhead. And on July 25th, Operation Cobra struck. 2,500 Allied aircraft dropped their bombs on a narrow stretch of the German front west of Saint-Laurent. The German line did not bend. It ceased to exist. Within days, Patton's Third Army, the real one, not the ghost, was pouring through the gap, moving faster than the German command could respond. The encirclement began. The 15th Army finally received its orders to move south. The roads were already jammed with the wreckage of retreating divisions. The fighter bombers owned every hour of daylight. The Falaise pocket closed. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were captured or killed in a cauldron of fire and collapsed roads and burning vehicles. The German army in France ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force, and the 15th Army arrived too late to change a single thing. In the post-war interrogations, Allied officers asked captured German commanders one simple question: when had they first believed the Pas de Calais invasion was never coming? The answers were staggering. Almost none of them had seriously questioned it until late July. Several held the belief into August. One general, his name redacted in the British transcripts, said something the interviewing officer underlined twice in his notes. He said the intelligence about the Pas de Calais had been too consistent, too clean. Real intelligence, he said, is messy. Real agents contradict each other. Real reports contain errors and rumors and partial information. The picture they received had been perfectly coherent, perfectly aligned with their expectations, perfectly structured from every direction. In retrospect, he said, that should have been the warning. But it was the kind of warning you only recognize when you are no longer standing inside the frame. He was right. The Germans had not been defeated by cunning alone. They had been defeated by their own certainty. The Pas de Calais conviction had not been planted by the British. It had been there long before Fortitude existed, rooted in pure military logic, sustained by 5 years of professional confidence. The British had simply found it, fed it, and grown it until it was large enough to strangle an army. Garbo had not fooled Hitler by inventing something new. He had found what Hitler already believed and made it irresistible. He had understood something about the human mind that the entire German general staff had somehow missed. The most dangerous lie is never the one that contradicts your beliefs. It is the one that confirms them perfectly. Juan Pujol García was awarded the Iron Cross by Germany, which believed to its final days that he was their most loyal and most valuable intelligence asset. He was awarded the Member of the Order of the British Empire by the Crown, which knew that he had been neither German nor British in his loyalties. He had simply been a man who hated fascism enough to destroy it, one fictional report at a time. After the war, he moved to Venezuela and lived under a false name for decades, officially listed as dead. His real identity was not confirmed until the 1980s. By then, the men he had deceived were old or gone, and the war he had helped win was being taught to a new generation as something clean and decided. beaches and heroes, and the inevitable tide of history. What is rarely taught is the invisible architecture behind it, the Ghost Army. The inflatable tanks, the 27 agents who never existed. The message that held 250,000 soldiers frozen on the wrong coast while the world changed without them. The greatest military operation in history succeeded on the beaches, yes, but it was won in a quiet office in London, by a man with no rank, no weapons, and no soldiers. It was won with language and patience, and the deep understanding that the most powerful force in any war is not firepower, it is what the man on the other side of the hill believes. Adolf Hitler was not defeated because he was outfought. He was defeated because he was out-imagined. Because somewhere across the channel, a chicken farmer looked at the certainty of the most powerful military mind in Europe and saw with perfect clarity exactly what it needed to hear. And then he told it. Every word a lie. Every lie a masterpiece. Every masterpiece another nail in the coffin of the Third Reich.